It was nearly midnight. There is here fluorescent lights, the smell of disinfectant and burnt coffee. My loved one was in the emergency room after an unexpected accident. As the automatic doors of the emergency room closed, my heart was still pounding. And my inbox lit up. Subject line position update. Before I open that email, could you tell me what the temperature is where you live if you're still listening? Please leave your lucky number in the comments. The email was short. Your position has been eliminated effective immediately. Reason: reduction of benefit liability exposure. Translation: they didn't want to pay roughly $3,000 in medical coverage. Signer: Graham Whitmore, our CEO. The person he just fired was me, Senior Director of Corporate Finance. The person who structured our $28 million credit facility. The one who negotiated the bank covenants line by line. The one who built the internal compliance framework that kept our credit rating intact. Apparently, I was a line item. $3,000. I stared at the screen while the heart monitor from behind the ER doors beeped in uneven rhythm. Shock doesn't feel loud. It feels hollow, like your name has been erased in ink you didn't know was temporary. I didn't cry. I opened my laptop. Public filings load slowly on hospital Wi-Fi. But numbers don't lie. I pulled up the latest credit agreement summary. And there it was, the detail Whitmore never bothered to remember. I am listed by name in the bank documentation as the company's qualified financial oversight officer, a designated covenant compliance authority. Terminate me without replacement. And the company risks breaching a key personnel clause. I closed my laptop slowly. $3,000. That was the math. What Whitmore forgot is that math works both ways. Before we continue, I want to be clear with you. The story you're about to hear is a blend of real workplace situations and fictional elements, with artificial intelligence used to deepen the emotional experience and help deliver the message. I hope it resonates with you, and if it doesn't, that's okay too. Please rest well and take care of yourself tonight. 3 days after I left the hospital, I was home at my kitchen table, laptop open, coffee untouched. When the bank's notice arrived, the company's $28 million credit facility had been placed under heightened monitoring. Clean wording, polite tone, quiet alarm bell, across town. Graham Whitmore was in the boardroom delivering his usual confidence. It's just a technical variance. He told them, a technical variance. That's what he called the absence of the senior director of corporate finance, the person named in the covenant documentation as qualified financial oversight authority, the person he terminated to save $3,000. I remembered 5 years of financial restructuring, midnight calls with lenders, negotiations that shaved interest by over $1 million annually, emails I sent warning him not to sign a personal guarantee during refinancing. He signed anyway. He wanted the additional voting shares. He liked control more than insulation. Now the bank had given the company 15 days to cure the personnel breach or provide acceptable replacement certification. 15 days to prove stability. I didn't call an attorney. I didn't draft a complaint. Instead, I called an old contact who manages a distressed credit fund. I asked one question. If the loan gets downgraded, what's the discount? There was a pause on the line. Then a number, lower than I expected. Later that afternoon, the bank issued a second notice internally. Contingency planning had begun. If the breach wasn't cured, the loan could be reassigned. Whitmore called it temporary noise. I called it timing. By the end of the second week, the downgrade was no longer theoretical. The bank adjusted the internal risk rating on the $28 million facility, citing unresolved covenant exposure tied to key personnel certification. Clean language again? Professional? Detached. Risk had a new price. Banks do not like uncertainty. They like predictability, signatures, and breathing room. A loan drifting toward technical breach without visible remediation becomes expensive to hold. Capital allocation committees prefer clean exits to prolonged supervision. That preference is where leverage begins. I didn't move impulsively. I formed a special purpose vehicle fully registered, fully compliant. 2 former institutional contacts agreed to participate. They knew my track record. They had seen me renegotiate million-dollar spreads before. This wasn't revenge, it was distressed credit strategy. We submitted a discreet expression of interest to acquire the facility at a 17 to 18% discount, contingent on transfer of all associated rights. The bank evaluated the proposal for less than 48 hours. They were not sentimental about borrowers. They were mathematical. Approval came through on a Thursday afternoon. Across town, Graham Whitmore was polishing slides for what he called his cost efficiency initiative. I saw the deck summary through Public Investor Notes lean staffing, optimized benefits, margin discipline. He was selling austerity as leadership. He had no idea his company's primary lender had reassigned its exposure. The transfer documentation was thorough: assignment of rights, enforcement authority, access to collateral schedules. I read every line slowly, the way I used to read them on the company's behalf. That was when I found the clause. Buried in the refinancing appendix was a personal guarantee executed by Whitmore himself, 40% of the outstanding balance. Triggered if technical violations were not cured within the notice period. He had signed it months earlier to secure additional voting shares during recapitalization. Control has a cost, and now I owned the paper. The official transfer notice went out on a Monday morning. I know the timing because I scheduled it that way. Graham Whitmore received the assignment letter from the bank just after 9. By 10, he was on a call with his counsel. I wasn't in the room, but I could imagine the expression confident irritation first, then dismissive amusement, some distressed fund. He reportedly said, "Not my problem." That was before his attorney finished reading. The assignment of rights was clean and absolute. The bank had transferred the full $28 million facility, along with all enforcement authority, to my SPV, every covenant, every collateral schedule, every appendix, including the personal guarantee, when his lawyer reached the clause. The tone of the call changed. Under Section 14.3 of the refinancing appendix, Whitmore had executed a 40% personal guarantee in the event of uncured technical default. The 15-day remediation window had expired without certified replacement of the designated financial oversight officer. Me. The breach was no longer hypothetical. Whitmore was not just the CEO of a company under monitoring. He was personally liable for over $11 million. The notice I sent that afternoon was brief and precise. No theatrics, no adjectives. Pursuant to the executed guarantee agreement, payment is hereby demanded within the contractual cure period. Pay up, sir. I didn't threaten. I enforced. For months, Whitmore had spoken about discipline, about accountability to shareholders, about numbers being impartial. Now the numbers had his signature on them. By late afternoon, I received confirmation that his legal team had requested an emergency review of the collateral schedule. That was when the second realization hit him. His personal shares acquired during the recapitalization he engineered were pledged as security under the same refinancing structure. 40% guarantee, secured by equity collateral, if the obligation wasn't satisfied. I had the right to move against those shares. Control, once leveraged to silence dissent, was now leveraged against him. Whitmore had optimized a $3,000 expense. In doing so, he converted himself from executive authority into secured debtor. The math hadn't changed. The ownership had. Panic rarely announces itself. It starts as urgency, then escalates into desperation, disguised as strategy. Within 48 hours of receiving my demand notice, Graham Whitmore began shopping the debt. He contacted 2 regional banks, 1 private credit lender, and an investment firm he had praised publicly just months earlier. He pitched it as routine refinancing temporary noise, short-term pressure, nothing structural. Each institution performed the same review. Uncured covenant breach, pending enforcement under a valid personal guarantee. Collateral pledged, each declined. Liquidity, I've learned, disappears fastest when confidence erodes. When refinancing failed, Whitmore shifted tactics. He called an internal meeting and attempted to reposition the narrative. The breach, he claimed, resulted from incomplete reporting by the chief financial officer. According to him, The CFO had failed to certify compliance documentation on time. The CFO refused to sign a revised statement. "I won't misrepresent material risk," he told the board. By then, Whitmore's voice had changed from executive calm to controlled strain. That afternoon, he called me directly. "This is retaliation," he said. "You engineered this." I let him finish. "No." I replied, "This is math." There was silence, then accusation, then negotiation. He asked what it would take to withdraw enforcement. I answered plainly. $500,000 allocated to a severance relief fund for the employees laid off under his cost efficiency initiative. Public acknowledgement that terminating designated financial oversight without replacement triggered the breach. No spin. He laughed at first. Then he rejected it outright. "I don't negotiate under pressure." He said, "You already did." I answered. What Whitmore failed to understand was that the market watches filings more closely than executive speeches. Distressed debt transfers are not invisible. Within days, analysts flagged the reassignment of the $28 million facility in regulatory updates. Financial media began asking questions. Why had the primary lender exited? Why was the CEO personally guaranteeing 40% of outstanding exposure? Why was the covenant breach unresolved by Friday morning? The company's stock had begun to slide. Whitmore had tried to contain a liquidity issue instead. It had become a credibility crisis. Markets do not scream, they adjust. By midweek, the company's stock had fallen just under 20%. Not a crash, not yet, but enough to trigger analyst calls, investor emails, and uncomfortable questions during trading hours. Volume spiked, confidence thinned. I watched it happen from my desk, calm and methodical. Whitmore responded the way executives always do when reality moves faster than their script. He scheduled an investor update and labeled the volatility temporary restructuring noise. Noise. The problem with that word is that filings are not noise. They are records. Public disclosures now reflected the reassignment of the $28 million credit facility. Analysts pulled the appendix. Financial journalists read the guarantee clause. 40% personal liability, tied to uncured covenant breach. Investors began connecting dots Whitmore had hoped would remain scattered. Within 48 hours, 2 institutional shareholders requested clarification from the board. The questions were specific. Was the personal guarantee disclosed at the time of refinancing? Why had the designated financial oversight officer not been replaced before termination? What remediation plan was in place inside the boardroom? The tone shifted from defensive to uneasy. "Why weren't we informed?" one director reportedly asked. That question is heavier than it sounds. It implies omission. It implies risk mismanagement. It implies governance failure. Whitmore attempted to contain it. He framed the guarantee as standard executive commitment. He described the personnel breach as administrative timing. He promised resolution within days. But resolution requires capital, and capital requires trust. I sent another formal notice that afternoon. 10 days remained before enforcement escalation. No threats, just the clock. The satisfaction I felt was not emotional, it was structural. The pressure was no longer mine to apply. It was embedded in documentation, in reporting requirements, in shareholder scrutiny. Whitmore had optimized cost by removing oversight. Now oversight had returned, external and unforgiving. By the end of the week, one independent board member requested an emergency governance review. The phrasing was deliberate. They weren't discussing refinancing anymore. They were discussing leadership. And when boards begin evaluating leadership during financial exposure, outcomes tend to accelerate. The fracture didn't happen all at once. It spread quietly through disclosures, transcripts, and uncomfortable pauses during board calls. By the start of the following week, the directors had reviewed the refinancing appendix in full. They saw the clause I had seen months ago, Graham Whitmore's personal guarantee tied to 40% of the outstanding facility. Triggered by uncured technical default, what unsettled them wasn't just the guarantee itself. It was the timeline. He had executed it without formally briefing the board on the scope of personal exposure or the collateral implications. The documentation existed. Yes, but disclosure is not the same as emphasis. Trust erodes in increments. I was not present in that room, but I received enough updates through regulatory channels to understand the tone. The questions shifted from defensive to pointed. Why was the key oversight officer terminated without a certified replacement? Why was the board not alerted immediately once the bank issued heightened monitoring? Whitmore requested an extension from me that afternoon. His message was restrained, almost conciliatory. "We need additional time to restructure the exposure," he wrote. I responded within minutes. "You said it was just numbers." There is power in returning language to its origin. The board convened an emergency session that evening. Governance Council attended. So did outside advisors. The discussion moved from refinancing strategy to executive accountability. Personal guarantees tied to corporate leverage are not inherently improper, but undisclosed risk concentration, especially when it triggers market reaction, is another matter entirely. By close of business, the board announced that Whitmore would be temporarily relieved of operational authority pending resolution of the debt exposure. An interim committee would oversee negotiations. It was not yet removal, but it was displacement, and displacement shifts leverage. What they likely had not yet fully processed was the collateral schedule attached to the guarantee. His personally acquired voting shares secured during recapitalization were pledged as part of the refinancing structure if the guarantee were formally enforced and remained unsatisfied. I had the right to proceed against that equity. Whitmore believed he was negotiating time. In reality, the clock was attached to ownership. If you believe enforcing the personal guarantee instead of walking away was the right move, leave a 1 in the comments, because every voice reminding leaders that accountability matters keeps stories like this from being dismissed as just numbers. Deadlines don't shout. They arrive. On the final morning of the cure period, no wire confirmation appeared. No refinancing agreement materialized. No emergency capital infusion cleared. Graham Whitmore had tried private lenders, bridge financing, even informal outreach to major shareholders. None were willing to fund a personal guarantee tied to an uncured covenant breach under active board review. Liquidity had limits. By noon, the contractual window closed. I authorized enforcement. The process was procedural, not dramatic. Under the refinancing structure, Whitmore's personally pledged voting shares were listed as secured collateral against the guarantee. Upon default, the holder of the assigned rights, that was me, could initiate a freeze pending transfer proceedings. The notice went out electronically, within hours. The transfer agent confirmed the restriction. Whitmore's shares were locked. No sale, no transfer, no voting authority attached to them until resolution. Control. The asset he had protected so aggressively was suddenly inert. He called again. "You're destabilizing the company," he said. "The company was destabilized when governance failed," I replied. By late afternoon, the board convened under emergency protocol. With Whitmore's pledged shares frozen, his voting power diminished materially. Interim leadership presented exposure scenarios, enforcement continuation, settlement under revised terms, or executive transition. The discussion was no longer about optics, it was about survivability. I did not attend the meeting, but outcomes are public record. The board voted to formally remove Graham Whitmore as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately, citing breach of fiduciary oversight and failure to mitigate disclosed financial risk. There are moments when tension peaks and reversibility disappears. This was one of them. The man who eliminated my role to optimize a $3,000 expense had just lost the position he leveraged to justify it. Enforcement did not feel emotional. It felt final. Whitmore had gambled that short-term optics would outweigh structural compliance. When the deadline expired, structure prevailed. And once ownership leverage shifts, it rarely shifts back. Removal didn't end the exposure, it clarified it. With Whitmore officially out as CEO, the board's priority shifted from optics to containment. The personal guarantee remained enforceable, the collateral freeze remained active, and the outstanding obligations still existed on paper, accumulating interest under the original terms. 2 days after his removal, Whitmore requested formal settlement discussions through counsel. This time, there was no accusation in his tone, only calculation. The negotiation was structured, documented, supervised by independent advisors. There would be no handshake shortcuts. The numbers were straightforward, the guaranteed portion of the debt, accrued interest, enforcement costs, and penalty fees triggered by the uncured covenant breach. Whitmore agreed to satisfy the guaranteed balance in full. In addition, he consented to fund a $500,000 relief trust designated for employees terminated under the prior cost efficiency program. The fund would be administered independently, with board oversight. The final component was not financial. He issued a public statement acknowledging that terminating designated financial oversight without structured replacement had materially contributed to lender reassessment and market volatility. It was carefully worded, but it was unmistakably accountability. I did not return to the company. I had no interest in reclaiming a seat built on reaction. Instead, once the guaranteed obligation was fully wired and collateral released, I reassigned the remaining facility to a secondary credit buyer at a negotiated premium. Distressed assets, once stabilized, trade efficiently. The transaction closed cleanly, documented, profitable. Justice, when structured properly, is not theatrical. It is enforceable. The twist Whitmore likely did not anticipate was embedded in the fine print even after satisfying the principal amount. He remained responsible for contractual interest, late fees, and enforcement expenses accrued during the default period. Those charges were not optional, they were calculated. He had tried to measure my value at $3,000. The market recalculated his. The final meeting took place in a quiet conference room that no longer had his name on the door. Whitmore looked older, not physically diminished, but structurally reduced. Authority leaves a person differently than money does. Money can be rebuilt. Credibility is harder. He didn't waste time. "You ruined my career," he said. There was no anger left in his voice, only accusation shaped by regret. I studied him for a moment, remembering the email that arrived while I sat in the emergency room. The subject line, the phrase benefit liability exposure, the $3,000 calculation. "I didn't ruin your career," I replied evenly. "You fired your risk manager to save $3,000. Silence followed. Not dramatic silence. Accounting silence. He had satisfied the guarantee, paid accrued interest, covered penalties and enforcement fees, funded the $500,000 relief trust, issued the statement the board required. The system had processed him thoroughly. There was no bankruptcy, no spectacle, no ruined family, only consequence. Corporate structures are designed to protect organizations from emotion, contracts, covenants, collateral schedules. They exist so that outcomes follow behavior. When Whitmore chose optics over oversight, he triggered a clause. When he ignored remediation, the clause activated. When he failed to fund the guarantee, collateral shifted. It was never personal. It was arithmetic. $3,000. That was the number he optimized. One uncured covenant breach. That was the number that optimized him. He looked at me as if expecting satisfaction to show. But satisfaction is loud. What I felt was steadier than that resolution. Before I stood to leave, I offered the only advice that mattered. "Next time," I said, "read your covenants." Then I walked out, not victorious in noise, but aligned with structure. And structure, unlike ego, does not miscalculate. I learned something no finance textbook ever spelled out. Numbers are never just numbers. They carry values, priorities, and sometimes a person's dignity. When I was reduced to a $3,000 expense, it wasn't the money that hurt, it was the message. It said I was optional, replaceable, disposable. What changed everything wasn't anger, it was clarity. I didn't fight with noise. I responded with structure, contracts, covenants, accountability. The real lesson isn't about revenge. It's about understanding the systems around you. Know what you sign. Know what protects you. Know what protects others. Leadership without responsibility collapses under its own shortcuts. And silence, when strategic, can be stronger than outrage. If you were in that position, cut to optimize costs. Dismissed as a line item, what would you do? Would you walk away quietly? Would you burn it down emotionally? Or would you learn the rules well enough to make them work properly? I'm curious, where are you listening from right now, different places? Same struggle. This story isn't about one CEO losing a seat. It's about reminding anyone who feels underestimated that competence is power. And integrity compounds. When you subscribe, like, or share this video, you're not boosting an algorithm, you're helping this message reach someone who might need the reminder that they are not a line item. Your engagement could shift how someone thinks about their own worth. And sometimes, that's how real change begins. This story was fully created and produced by our team. We do not copy or borrow content from any other channel. Thank you for staying with us and listening until the end.